So this is our third study on moral questions and Bible answers, and this is entitled Justice and Honesty for the day.
My dearly beloved brothers and sisters, excuse me, and young people, when one sits down to research a subject, one of the first things I suppose we ought to do is to consult an English dictionary to determine what is meant by certain words. We then consulted the Cambridge Dictionary, which suggests the following: that justice speaks of fairness, the glue that holds societies together, and honesty, telling the truth or able to be trusted. And I suppose those definitions may be true in modern English. But as we delve deeper into these words, we discover that a more profound appreciation is necessary. Considering that the general theme of our subject matter under consideration is that of moral questions and Bible answers, it becomes necessary to determine what the Bible means by these words, which I suggest to you becomes much deeper and more profound than we understand in modern colloquial English. For example, if you were to research justice on the internet, you would find that it predominantly, not completely, but predominantly is used in the context of various forms of discrimination by people who have a view in opposition to what might be called the establishment. We need therefore to turn to the scriptures to determine what the Bible says about these matters. And when we check out what the Bible records about justice, we find that it doesn't appear in the New Testament at all. And it appears in the Old Testament just 28 times. Although we do come across similar words in the New Testament, such as to be just and to be righteous, words like that. So we've got two Hebrew words translated as justice. The one is Tzadak, T-S-A-D-A-Q, also translated as righteous, righteousness, and just, and that occurs over 300 times, and it literally means to be just or to be made righteous. And the other Hebrew word is mishpat, translated normally as judge or judgment, and that appears over 600 times. And it has basic meaning to judge, to make a judgment on a matter. For example, it's recorded in Job in chapter 36 and verse 17, "But thou hast fulfilled the judgment of the wicked, judgment and justice shall take hold on thee." And those two words together, they appear a number of times also in the Old Testament scriptures, and they are linked together quite often. Then there is a Greek word, dikaios. It doesn't translate as justice at all, but it occurs some 80 times, and it means literally to be righteous, normally translated as just. So what about honesty? Well, it only appears once, and that is in the first epistle of Timothy, chapter 2, and verses 1 to 2, where we read, "I exhort therefore that first of all supplications, prayers, intercessions, and giving of thanks be made for all men, for kings and for all that are in authority, that we may lead a quiet and peaceable life in all godliness and honesty." And that is the only occurrence in the Bible of that word. It is a Greek word, semnotes, which means something or person who demands reverence. And that is, I believe, significant in our consideration this afternoon. And that Greek word appears some 3 times, but only once, as we say, as honesty. But if we were to research the words honesty, honest, or honestly, we'd find that 11 times, but of those 11 times, there's 4 different Greek words. When we take all this into consideration and have a look to see what it's actually telling us, the point becomes evident for us that the Bible teaches that justice and honesty are characteristics of the very highest quality and standard. But when we look around the world about us today, there are qualities which often are lacking. We only need to look in the evidence of unscrupulous dealings in business, in politics, in sport, and in fact almost every corner of today's world. And justice and honesty often are lacking. It's a factor which the Bible picks up on regularly. Come with me, if you would, to the prophecy of Ezekiel and chapter 22. Because there in that prophecy, God passes judgment on the nation of Israel for their dishonesty. Ezekiel chapter 22 and at verse 13, "Behold, therefore, I have smitten mine hand at thy dishonest gain, which thou hast made," he says to his people. And then we go down to verse 27. "Her princes in the midst thereof are like wolves ravening the prey, to shed blood and to destroy souls, to get dishonest gain." And that's probably a fair commentary on not only Israel in those far off times, but in our modern society. There is much of it that goes on, as you know as well as I. And regarding the unjust, if we'd like to go to Psalm 43 and at verse 1, "Judge me, O God, and plead my cause against an ungodly nation. O deliver me from the deceitful and unjust man." And it was the Apostle Paul in the 1st of Corinthians in chapter 6 who declared, "Know ye not that the unrighteous, that is, the unjust, shall not inherit the kingdom of God? Be not deceived. Neither fornicators, nor idolaters, nor adulterers, nor effeminate, nor abusers themselves with mankind, nor thieves, nor covetous, nor drunkards, nor revilers, nor extortioners shall inherit the kingdom of God." Well, really, that cuts everybody out, or the vast majority of the population out, does it not? Because there are many who come into at least one of those categories. But what we ought to do now is cast our mind back 3,500 years or thereabouts. The children of Israel were captive in Egypt. And if there'd been a nation that had been treated unjustly, where injustices have been shown unto them, it was they. The injustices that they experienced were extreme, to say the least. So we want now to go to Exodus in chapter 1 and notice what the Bible commentates, how it relates these issues to us. Verse 8 of Exodus in chapter 1. "Now there rose up a new king over Egypt, which knew not Joseph, and he said unto his people, Behold, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than me. So the king of Egypt, Pharaoh, comes to this realization that the children of Israel are growing. And as they're growing, he perceived that they were a threat to his nation. Therefore, we find in verse 11, they did set over them taskmasters to afflict them with their burdens, and they built for Pharaoh treasure cities, Pithom and Ramesses. And so they basically made the children of Israel slaves under hard work and pressure, much tribulation. It was what people would call today injustices and racial discrimination. In due course, God brought 10 disastrous plagues on the nation of Egypt, which resulted in the lifting of these injustices on his people. And the final plague of the 10 saw the death of all of Egypt's firstborn, which coincided with the institution of the Israelites' feast of Passover and their deliverance out of Egypt. And then over the next 50 days, the children of Israel miraculously crossed the Red Sea under God's hand. A miracle which saw also the drowning of the military might of Egypt. And then following those 50 days, God brought Israel to Mount Sinai, where he constituted them as a nation. Now we need to remember that they'd been something like 400 years in Egypt. So Egyptian culture had had an impact upon them. And so in that place, God outlined to them a law of divine principles, which they were expected to abide by. These laws taught them a whole new concept, which was foreign to their Egyptian experiences. And the basis of that law, known as the Law of Moses, was what has become known as the Ten Commandments, or Tables of the Covenant, as revealed in chapter 20 of Exodus, part of which we read together earlier. And in these 10 Commandments, the first 4 related to God, the 5th to parents, and the last 4 to the individual's relationships with his fellow man, thereby establishing a principle, an important principle, that God comes first, domestic obligations next, and then the obligation towards one's fellow man third. Consideration of oneself comes last. The irony of all that is that in the day in which we live, man's first consideration, very often sadly, is himself, and he considers others after him. But God, as it were, is twisting the emphasis and establishing the point that yourself is the last person that you need to consider. But the significance of our subject of honesty, justice and honesty, is that we will see the characteristics of those true principles throughout these 10 commandments. Hopefully we'll see that here this afternoon. So we come to the first commandment in this 20th chapter, and we read there in verse 1, and God spake all these words, saying, I am the Lord thy God, which have brought thee out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Now, they had been reminded there, as we have just read in verse 2, that they had been released out of the Egyptian injustices which they had experienced. A place where they'd only been offered hard labour in abundance, much sadness, and eventually death in a hostile land. Their first consideration now, and that of the serious Bible reader today, is that he or she must honour God. That must be the main emphasis, which is done by showing him our reverence. Now, you might remember that when we briefly looked at the meanings of these words, justice and honesty, that the word in the Bible has to do with reverence. It has to do with respect. And this is the essential ingredient of this first commandment of respect unto God. And to do this, it demands that we don't worship whatever else demands our attention. You see, there are many things in this world that people worship. They may not see it as that. But it could be their work, it could be their sport, it could be their leisure activity, whatever it is, whatever takes their attention, they in fact worship it. And yet before long, all of these things that claim our attention today, which are passing, will come crashing down. Come with me briefly to Isaiah in chapter 2. It speaks here of idolatry. And anything that replaces God for our attention can be an idol. Isaiah chapter 2 and verse 18. And the idols he shall utterly abolish, and they shall go into the holes of the rocks and into the caves of the earth for fear of Yahweh and for the glory of his majesty, when he ariseth to shake terribly the earth. Such it shall be. So the important message to us from this first commandment in Exodus chapter 20 is that we have to revere him. We have to fear him. We have to respect him. We take note of what he says. And there is to be nothing that would stand between us and him. We might find that difficult, but that's what the record says. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. So we move on to the second commandment in verse 4 of Exodus 20. Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image, or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. Now this law is very specific. The manufacture of any image was forbidden, whether it's something that's in the heavens, that's on the earth, or below the water. Therefore, it was not allowed for the Israelite to even try to replicate the visage of God himself. The importance was not to make something to look like him, but to honour him by demonstrating his character, not by replicating what man might think he looks like. It's recorded again in the prophet Isaiah, and this time chapter 40 and verse 18. To whom then will ye liken God? Or what likeness will ye compare unto him? The workman melteth a graven image, and the goldsmith spreadeth it over with gold, and casteth silver chains. Well, that was what the Egyptians did, from whom they'd been delivered, when they made images to replicate almost every living creature and treated them as gods. But they can't be gods, because God made them all. Sadly though, despite the fact that Israel had been delivered and redeemed out of Egypt under the mighty hand of God, almost in no time at all, they returned to the gods of the Egyptians, as the matter of the golden calf testifies, where they tried to mix Egyptian deities with Yahweh their God, although it was forbidden. Keep a marker here in Exodus 20 and go to chapter 32 if you would. Chapter 32 and verse 4. We'll pick it up in verse 2. And Aaron said unto them, break off the golden earrings which are in the ears of your wives, of your sons and of your daughters, and bring them unto me. And all the people brake off the golden earrings which were in their ears, and brought them unto Aaron. And he received them at their hand, and fashioned it with a graven tool, after he had made it, a molten calf. And they said, these be thy gods, O Israel, which broughtest thee up out of the land of Egypt. I wonder if they really knew what they were saying. Because what they're saying there is, this molten calf is the God that brought you out of Egypt. But they knew Yahweh had done it, the God of Israel. He had brought them out of Egypt. And so they're creating this calf, as it were, to represent God himself. And that's further emphasised when the record says, and when Aaron saw it, he built an altar before it, and Aaron made proclamation and said, tomorrow is a feast to Yahweh. So the mixing up pagan deities with God himself. But what had commandment 2 say? Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image of any likeness of anything that is in heaven above. However, despite their weaknesses, the mercy of God was still evident to this people. Because this second commandment continues in verse 5. Thou shalt not bow down thyself to them, nor serve them. For I, Yahweh thy God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children, unto the third and the fourth generation of them that hate me, and showing mercy unto thousands of them that love me, and keep my commandments. The word mercy here is a Hebrew word kesed, and speaks of kindness, favour and pity, as opposed to mercy in the sense of mercy for the forgiveness of sins. Kindness, favour and pity is closely associated with the scriptural idea of honesty. It speaks of God's goodness toward those who keep his commandments. For as John wrote in his epistles, this is love, that we walk after his commandments. And that's how we're honest before God, by following what he says. Or literally, the Hebrew for showing mercy unto thousands, to them that love me, is showing mercy to the 1,000th generation of them that love me. Consequently, his loving kindness is boundless. Therefore, as we reflect on this second commandment, we find these two principles which concern us this afternoon. One, of justice, is seen here in the Kesed of divine kindness, which is a characteristic that we all ought to emulate if we are to be a beneficiary of it. And honesty before God, demanding that we revere him and honour him. If not, we shall suffer the consequences. What brings us to the third commandment in verse 7. Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless that taketh his name in vain. So the importance of being honest expands here into this third commandment, because there was more involved than a refusal to be associated with idolatry. Because taking God's name in vain means to take it lightly. We then need to take great care, because we can easily become hypocritical, even if we recognise and revere his greatness. We can be hypocritical by professing him, but by not living up to his characteristics. Because it was the Apostle Paul who, when he wrote to his son Timothy in the faith, said, "The Lord knoweth them that are his, and let everyone that nameth the name of Christ depart from iniquity." There are a number of ways in which we can take the name of God's name lightly. We can do it by breaking promises. And we can all easily make promises to do as he says, and then fail to do it. The preacher wrote in Ecclesiastes chapter 5, "When thou vowest a vow unto God, defer not to pay it. For he hath no pleasure in fools. Pay that which thou vowed." And so this third commandment concludes, "For Yahweh will not hold him guiltless that taketh his name in vain, nor will he." And so we come to the fourth commandment. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. I'm sure you're aware that the law of the Sabbath does not apply today. But that does not mean that its principles are not relevant. We find that the honouring of God deepens even further here. Because on the Sabbath day, there was to be no servile work. It was on the Sabbath day that reverence of God came to its highest position in the week. There was to be no servile work done on the Sabbath. But that does not mean there was no work to be done. There was plenty that had to be done, but only work in God's service. Notice what Jesus said about this, as recorded in Matthew chapter 12. "Have ye not read in the law how that on the Sabbath days the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are blameless? They profaned the Sabbath because they worked. But they did God's work. And therefore they were blameless. So what was the importance of this Sabbath day? To keep it holy. Therefore, once more, God and his purpose need to be held in the highest esteem. And this is what we have to do. To be honest before God. Man was therefore to give himself to God in a fuller sense than he could have done in the previous 6 days. And then we come to the 5th commandment. The 5th commandment, as we shall see, is a link between the first 4 and the last 6. We notice the sense changes. Because in commandments 1 to 4, to be honest and just before God, there is then given, in each of those, there is given an explanation. For example, thou shalt have, the first one, thou shalt have no other gods before me. Then is explained, thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image. And so you get a similar pattern with commandments 1, 2, 3 and 4. But commandments 5 to 10 is different. In which the sense is that we might act justly and honestly with others. So that justice and honesty come through in these final 6. And it's emphatic. We don't have the explanation. We simply have the commandment. Although, in some ways, the 5th commandment acts as a link between the first 4 and the last 5. Because it's interesting to note that the 10 commandments were inscribed on 2 tables of stone. Presumably the first 5 were on one, and the last 5 on the second. And we've seen that the first stone bore commandments which related to God, while the second to human relationships. But the 5th commandment relates to both, to God and to our human relationships. And in relation, in a commentary on this commandment, come with me if you would to Ephesians in chapter 6 and at verse 2. Ephesians 6 and verse 2. Honour thy father and mother, which is the first commandment with promise, that it may be well with thee, and thou mayest live long on the earth. Now, the point of this commandment is that the Father is the common denominator. And here, the idea of the natural family becomes the basis of the spiritual family. Because if the individual will learn to honour his mother and his father, those are exactly the same principles that when he gets to adulthood, he respects the spiritual father, even God himself. And what we're seeing again is the principle of honesty, of this reverence to God, and also reverence to his natural parentage shining through. And we get the same idea with the justice, treating one's own family justly, which is further enhanced spiritually in the principle of divine righteousness. We'll move on. The sixth commandment, verse 13 of Exodus chapter 20. This is very emphatic. Thou shalt not kill. No explanation. This commandment has a clear reference to fair justice and honesty while dealing with unauthorised killings. What it does not affect, I must say, is cases like the numerous commandments by God to slay the wicked, because they were acts of righteousness. They were acts of true justice. They were acts of a just God. We know, we accept that they're at variance with the modern unscriptural concept of human rights. But nevertheless, it is the correct way. And it's very important that we don't get confused between human justice and divine justice. One is based on emotion and the other is based on God's righteousness. And righteous anger is a true divine principle. But we must not blur the issues. See, there are certain principles that we need to live our lives by. See, righteous anger can be excused by some for doing things that they ought not. For example, the Apostle Paul said when he wrote to the Ephesians in chapter 4 and verse 26, "Be ye angry and sin not. Let not the sun go down upon your wrath." So you can be angry, but don't let it allow you to do things that you shouldn't. Matthew chapter 5 and verse 22, Jesus said that whosoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of the judgment. And for a bishop, Paul wrote to Titus in his first chapter, the bishop must be blameless as the steward of God and not self-willed, not soon angry. And so therefore is laid down a principle. If it's just righteous anger, that is acceptable. But if the human emotion gets involved and you hurt people or even kill them, that is wrong. It has to be a true assessment. The seventh commandment, verse 14. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Now, adultery is clearly prohibited throughout the Bible. The breakdown of marriage, however, becomes intrinsically linked with our two topics under consideration of justice and honesty. Because justice, the opposite of that, of course, is injustice. And that is often what occurs, is it not? With a breakdown of marriage. Well, just let us consider what the prophet Malachi wrote in his 3rd chapter. Malachi chapter 3 and verse 15. sorry, I think it's chapter 2. Yes, chapter 2 verse 15. And did not he make one? Yet had he the residue of the Spirit, and wherefore one, that he might seek a godly seed. Therefore take heed to your spirit. Let none deal treacherously against the wife of his youth. For it's a divine commandment. You have to be just and righteous and true with one's wife and husband or husband. And we've established that honesty, scripturally speaking, speaks of reverence. Well, over in Ephesians and chapter 5, the apostle wrote this. So ought men to love their own wives as their own bodies. He that loveth his wife loveth himself. And no man ever hated his own flesh. So we come to the 8th commandment. Thou shalt not steal. Well, it could not be any more unambiguous or clear-cut. We're left with no questions to wonder here what our responsibilities are. Stealing is possibly the greatest example of dishonesty. To steal or to rob cannot, of course, be allowed under any circumstances, which is a concept most simple to understand. But when we ponder the significance of its application, we find it so difficult to manifest. Theft can be seen in many ways. In regard to the living of the truth, it can have many facets. And the facts are that our nature sometimes can convince us that certain activities are acceptable, although they are not. We have just here 4 words. Thou shalt not steal. We're left with a clear impression how we ought to behave in this regard. And Paul in Ephesians chapter 4 advocates that we should observe scrupulous integrity. He said, let him that stole steal no more, but rather let him labour, working with his hands, the thing which is good, that he may have to give to him that needeth. Sadly, in 2022, we live in an age of dishonesty. Petty thieving is increasing rapidly throughout society, but that's nothing new. Because 2,500 years ago, in the time of Malachi, he wrote, will a man rob God? Yet you've robbed me. But ye say, wherein have we robbed thee? In tithes and offerings. Problem was, we can steal without knowing it. See, what the prophet here outlines is so prevalent in our times as there prevails a dishonest attitude in regard to many things. In fact, dishonesty is seen in many ways and at times is almost unrecognisable because it's become a way of life. And it was Jesus who decried as thieves and robbers those shepherds who failed to minister to the flock as directed by God. He wrote in John chapter 10, verily, verily, I say unto you, he that entereth not by the door into the sheepfold, but climbeth up some other way, the same is a thief and a robber. Then in Mark chapter 11, he described the religious leaders of his time when they turned the temple of God into a den of thieves. We see the same today, particularly in the Roman Catholic Church. And so we come to the 9th commandment. Thou shalt not bear false witness against thy neighbour, as recorded in verse 16. Injustice and dishonesty are both involved here. To falsely slander the character of someone else is to bear false witness against him. When I was growing up, and less so now, although you do see it from time to time, many houses had a plaque on the wall which read, "Christ is the head of this house, the unseen guest at every meal, the silent visitor, listener to every conversation." And what that was, it was just a gentle reminder that what was said, what was done, was seen and was heard. We need to bear these things in mind. And we need to go to the Epistle of James to consider this. James in chapter 3, first of all. And verse 8. But the tongue can no man tame. It's an unruly evil, full of deadly poison. I therewith bless we God, even the Father, and therewith curse we men, which are made after the similitude of God. Out of the same mouth proceedeth blessing and cursing. My brethren, these things ought not so to be, nor should they. And we turn over the page, verse 11 of chapter 4. Speak not evil one of another, brethren. He that speaketh evil of his brother and judgeth his brother speaketh evil of the law and judgeth the law. But if thou judge the law, thou art not a doer of the law, but a judge. And we can add, as James had in chapter 3, these things ought not so to be. And so we come to the 10th commandment in verse 17. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbour's house. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbour's wife, nor his manservant, nor his maidservant, nor his ox, nor his ass, nor anything that is thy neighbour's. The danger of the times in which we live is that covetousness is encouraged on every hand. For example, modern advertising is designed to make you and I to be discontented with what we've got and what we have, and to encourage us to want what others have. We may obtain these things by legal means, but very often they're not necessary. Because there was a prize at the end of the day which is grander than anything that world can give us. And that's recorded for us in Psalm 119. An antidote to all of these issues, to the dishonesty and the injustices that we see in the world. Psalm 119 and verse 105. Thy word is a lamp unto my feet and a light unto my path. That's what should govern us in our attitude, in our behaviour, in how we think, what we do. Allow the Bible to lead us. And it will teach us to lay before that which is to come, and not to be tempted by the temptations of the present. Or as Paul exhorted his son Timothy in 1 Timothy chapter 6, verse 6, godliness with contentment is great gain. For we brought nothing into this world, and it is certain that we can carry nothing out. And having food and raiment, let us be therewith content. Therefore, in conclusion, come with me to, first of all, 2 Corinthians and chapter 4. Verse 2. We'll pick up in verse 1. Therefore, seeing we have this ministry, as we have received mercy, we faint not. But have renounced the hidden things of dishonesty, not walking in craftiness, nor handling the word of God deceitfully, but by manifestation of the truth, commending ourselves to every man's conscience in the sight of God. And so, brethren and sisters and young people, let's echo with God's servant Solomon, who said, "Let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is the whole duty of man."